morning, everyone. Good morning, everybody. Good
morning.
All right, good to see you all. Welcome to the 2013-14 season of Primetime at the BU Library. I believe most of you all are familiar with me, Keith Brooks, from the Education Department and the Faculty Development Team. Primetime celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of fellow faculty, students, and staff, and is a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and many other offices on campus. If you'd like to see what's coming up at Primetime, you can check out the homepage of the new library website where our upcoming events are listed. And if you've missed one, most are recorded and can be viewed online in our BU Digital Library. Tuesday, November 5th, Dr. Ray Van Argen will present Intellectual Virtue and the Adventurous Christ Follower, which will become a chapter in the forthcoming book, Whole and Holy Persons, edited by Dr. Chris Garrett. Ray will explore some intellectual virtues that can offset the risk that comes with adventure. Today, we welcome Jay Milbrandt from the Business Department, who will present Rediscovering David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt that Saved Millions, in anticipation of his upcoming book on David Livingstone that is scheduled to be published in August of 2014. Let's welcome Jay this morning.
All right.
Well, thanks. It's really an honor to be able to talk about this project that I've wanted to talk about for the last 2 years or more that we've been working on it. And this is really the first opportunity I've had to share publicly as we're making some steps to get closer. And I finished writing the book this summer, and it's not edited yet, so we still have about 9 months of work before it will be out in next August. But we got a cover this last week. Here it is, and the book will be The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt that Saved Millions. We're publishing this with Thomas Nelson Publishers in the same publishing division that did the recent Bonhoeffer success. They've done the Wilberforce books. So it's just a fantastic team who believes in the project, and I couldn't be more thrilled with who we have to work with and the possibilities that opens up for us. Well, so what I thought I'd do this morning is tell you a little bit about the story and my own journey getting to know and rediscover David Livingstone. Hopefully you see him and will agree with me that he's somebody that we need to really rediscover collectively. My journey with David Livingstone starts on the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro several years ago. Was climbing, it was in Africa, I've been there several times, was climbing Kilimanjaro, and there's this experience where we're climbing up the mountain on a several-day trek, and you look up the mountain, and it's this line of porters that's carrying, you've got hundreds of people going up the mountain that day. They've got tents and food and backpacks and everything that you could imagine. And then you look behind you, and there's just this line of hundreds of porters coming up behind you on the mountain. I remember thinking, this is probably the way it was 200 years ago when they were opening up Africa. I can't imagine this has changed much. It's a very very rustic process, and it really inspired me that I want to read a book about how they opened up and explored Africa and what that experience was like. And so the name Livingstone stuck out to me. Actually, in Uganda, there are quite a few people named Livingstone as their first name as a result of David Livingstone. And so I knew that name and had some vague familiarity with it. And so went to the bookstore and found several books, including this one, actually, and found that most books focused on, not on Livingstone per se, but on Henry Morton Stanley, a journalist, finding David Livingstone in the jungle. And that was the story that was being told. Well, I also saw, in kind of discovering, reading even this book, some very vague statements that David Livingstone was interested in African slavery, the slave trade in East Africa, and he was interested in ending it. And so I said, well, he was working a lot in the global justice arena. That's the kind of book I want to read. Inspired by Wilberforce and some others who had recent kind of rediscovered in a way. And so I wanted to find a book about Livingstone and his interest in ending the slave trade. Well, I couldn't find it. It didn't exist. No one had told that part of the story. But what I did know was just kind of a vague structure. That Livingstone spoke out against slavery, and a little bit of a spoiler here, he dies lost and alone in Africa. But almost 30 days after his death, slavery is completely outlawed. Laws are brought down that make it illegal across the entire East Coast. So there's some kind of gap here. I consulted more biographies on Livingstone and others and found a gap both historically and thematically. Historically, the end of slavery, there's this vague attribution that Livingstone had a vision for it and somehow it ended. But no one had really connected the dots of history to Livingstone's passions against this, how he's outspoken, and the actual ending of it, the cause and effect, if you will. And then there was a thematic gap. Found that after Livingstone's death, there were a plethora of books written about him. Probably ones like this one here that really conspicuously glorified Livingstone with statements that he was a man of no fault and the ideal Christian. And these very almost outlandish statements where if you read in the other books, you find, well, that's not quite the case. Then you have more modern biographies that were written in the last 20 or 30 years that I would say take a populist, secular view of trying to discount Livingstone, trying to discount his faith, and trying to discount his accomplishments, and really portraying him as simply an explorer who's bent on finding the source of the Nile at all costs. And so I felt like there was something in the middle of these two, that there's something that's not quite the perfect person and not quite the simply an explorer because he started as a Christian missionary, and he certainly had a very strong faith that drove him, and that was an area that needed to be explored. And my take was that, kind of going into this, that Livingstone is a deeply human, broken person, but a person who, a hero of faith, who sacrificed his life to end one of the greatest atrocities that existed. And so in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'd like to tell you his story as I see it, and kind of tell you how my research intersected with it, and also ask a few questions that this community might be particularly helpful with. Livingstone grew up in poverty in Scotland, and to a fundamentalist Christian family, and really a life of child labor. He worked in the cotton mills as a piecer and worked long hours. And I think part of his passion against slavery is his upbringing, and feeling like most of his life he was a slave to the factories and the life that he was born into. Education is what lifted him out of poverty. He would study at night, he would study the Latin and any education he could get. He went on to medical school and to seminary, and it felt like he felt from a very early age a call to Christian missions, and that medical missions were the avenue that he could find a practical application of those two things. When an opportunity came to go to Africa, he went. And critics like to point out that Livingstone was a very unsuccessful missionary. He only converted one person to Christianity, who eventually relapsed to animism, so it was sort of a zero in the book. But Livingstone didn't really like sitting in these mission bases and preaching and trying to bring in shepherd a large flock in these locations. He preferred to go out into the far-flung villages, places where no European had ever been, a place where he could bring the gospel, but more importantly, he could open up trails and roads for the gospel to follow. In the process of this, he made some remarkable journeys. He made a land crossing where he walked up from South Africa to sort of the central part of Africa, and then crossed all the way to the west coast, and then walked all the way back to the east coast. Along the way, he was the first European to lay eyes on Victoria Falls, named it. He discovered the tsetse fly and documented that. He explored the prophylactics for malaria and discovered that quinine was a way to prevent and cure, if you will, malaria. And so did just incredible, amazing discoveries that were distinguished in a variety of categories. And really he found a new purpose, that going into Africa and opening up these trails, especially rivers, which he saw as God's highway, were the way in the future for Africa and the future for Christian faith. But he also saw slavery. He also saw a slave trade in East Africa that was growing, that was becoming quite violent, and it concerned him, and something that he brought up as would really become a central focus for him. And overall, he really dreamed of Africa as being a Christian continent. He felt like if we could make it a Christian continent, slavery would no longer exist there. Well, he returned to England to a hero's welcome. He dined with the Queen, he received honorary degrees, he spoke at Cambridge and Oxford, to packed houses, and he came with a vision, and a vision for business. His vision was commerce and Christianity. That Christian business was the solution for what he saw in Africa. That Africa needed trade, commerce, to supplant slavery, and then Christianity coupled with that as a moral force for good in that process. And so the British government offered to fund his next expedition. And he wanted to go to the Zambezi River, one of the largest rivers in East Africa, and set up a mission base, go up the river to Central Africa, set up a mission base and a trading post where he could accomplish both of those goals. From the very beginning, the Zambezi expedition was a complete disaster. Livingstone's leadership is terrible after spending the last several years in Africa on his own. He has no idea what to do. The team is plagued by malaria. Their boat that they're on is infested with cockroaches. And there's just leads to infighting among the crew. Livingstone eventually has to dismiss most of his crew. Morale bottoms out, and it's just almost everything that could go wrong does go wrong. The only one left with him is Dr. John Kirk, who will come up later again in the story and stays with him much longer. Every river that Livingstone tried, the Zambezi and other rivers that, when the Zambezi didn't work, ended in waterfalls. Unknown waterfalls that he didn't expect, and he was unable to get up the river and get to the areas where he had planned on traveling to. A mission group sent by Oxford and Cambridge universities came down. They were going to be the ones to establish the mission post and the base. They showed up, and the bishop who led that group, he ended up passing away to fever. Several of Livingstone's own teammates ended up passing away, and even Livingstone's wife came down to meet him, and within a few weeks of arriving, she passes away of fever. Everything that could go wrong, everything that you could imagine that could possibly happen, happened, and it was just a complete and utter disaster. To a certain degree here, we start to see Livingstone losing sight of some of his purpose and wrestling with faith and wrestling with God. He felt like God had brought him there and wanted him to be in Africa. And in the meantime, he also sees, he ends up at the epicenter of slave trade. He ends up at Lake Nyasa, one of the largest inland lakes, currently Lake Malawi, modern-day Lake Malawi. And here he sees the atrocious trade that is just ravaging the region, and people who are being killed for sport, in a way that populations there were so plentiful that it would be easier for these slave traders coming from Arabia, Arab slave traders, to simply kill someone who's slow or not carrying their load. Easier to kill someone than to try to keep them going and just go get someone else. And as the Zambezi expedition is spiraling into disaster, Livingstone is writing to the world about this, trying to tell the British government what he's seen and how they should end the slave trade. Eventually, as you can imagine, with all these terrible things that have happened and the lack of success of this expedition, it's recalled. And Livingstone returns to Britain, this time not as a hero, but as an embarrassment. And the British newspapers would rail against him as this was a waste of money and a waste of lives. People used to mob him on the streets after he came back as a hero, and now he would be shunned. He was no invitations. People didn't want him around. And it was a very different sort of experience than after his first expedition to Africa. Well, while he had been away in the Zambezi, which was almost 10 years, there was a new geographic question that had arose. what is the source of the Nile River? And this is perhaps the most important river in history. And the source had been wondered since the age of Ptolemy and Herodotus. Where does it come from? There are giant fountains somewhere in Africa coming up from the ground. Various explorers, prominent explorers of his day, had theories. And Livingstone didn't, because he had been away in the Zambezi. And so the Royal Geographic Society in Britain, which sponsored explorations, persuaded him to go into Africa and try to settle this matter, try to find the source of the Nile. Well, I conducted my own up-close personal research with the Nile. It's me, that's the Nile. And I can tell you that the source is painful. But this point with the question of Livingstone and the Nile problem, this is where my research takes a different turn. As things have gone so far, we're pretty much tracking with what biographers have found and what's in his journals. But modern biographers present Livingstone as a man trying to regain the limelight. He'll make statements where Livingstone will say how he feels like God is calling him back to Africa or to go someplace in Africa. And these populist secular biographers who are writing about him will say, well, this is just crazy. He's clearly delusional at this point, that he thinks that he's being called. So we see a split. And I think this is important because how you make a determination on what his intent is, what Livingstone's intent, if he goes back into Africa, that changes how you view the entire rest of his story. I spent a lot of time working in his original journals, finding letters that are spread around the world in libraries and places where he admits to friends that finding the Nile is only important now and giving him a platform where he can speak out against the slave trade, and how this is the great work. This is the great work of his life. This could be his purpose. And I think this is what a lot of the biographers miss, that they overlook, because there's an intent. There's something about his Christian faith that's driving him here, about what he sees as justice and right and wrong, that is the purpose that that a lot of people have missed in the last few years. And my interpretation of this is that the Nile, this quest to find the source of the Nile, is not just to settle a matter. It's not just to speak out about it. It's a publicity stunt. It's a publicity stunt that he's going back to try to make this great geographic discovery so that he can tell he once again has that platform, that heroic platform, if you will, upon which he can speak about what he's seen in Africa. And really, he's been the only one who's seen it, because he's the only one who's made it to these destinations. Well, this time Livingstone goes in alone. He assembles an African team, small African team. We find him soon lost, without food, and in a famine-stricken country. The only ones with food are the Arab slave traders. And this is complicated. Livingstone has to join them for sustenance and protection. And this is, again, where biographers become very critical of how can he speak out against the slave trade and at the same time rely on them, take food from them, take shelter from them. And it's a struggle. It's a struggle even for me to interpret what's going on. And I think, again, we sort of have to look at this lens and how we interpret his intents at this point. Is there a greater purpose that he's trying to achieve with what he's trying to do, and what is that? And in a little bit, I see a picture of Jesus in this, that he's comfortable even being in the company of people whom he sees as evil, dining with them and being with them, but it's a challenge. Well, eventually Livingstone ends up destitute, sick, and completely at the slaver's mercy. And here we start to see him beginning to waver, and I think fall and fracture a bit in both his faith and in his purpose. He begins to get completely obsessed with the Nile. And I think in part to being desensitized to the killing that's been happening on a daily basis. And he's been with them now for months and months, and I think it's hard for him to separate, again, what's right and wrong and what's normal and what should be expected. Well, we come to, as I see, the second turning point in his life. And he's in a village, a small village one day, in the market where he likes to go and just sort of watch people coming and going and doing commerce, seeing business in action, and gives him kind of a vision of what he'd like to see in Africa on a greater scale. And All of a sudden, these slavers come into the market, slave traders, and they open fire on the villagers. Just as a show of strength in the region, to show that we control this area, we control the village, and 300 plus unarmed villagers are just gunned down for no reason. This massacre completely shatters Livingstone and completely shatters all that he'd been doing in his quest for the Nile. He feels deeply convicted in his reliance upon the slavers and sets off alone with his porters and just to escape the slavers. And he travels to a village where he had prearranged some restocking of food before he started off on his expedition. And when he gets there, everything is gone. The slave traders had stolen all of his food, had taken all of his rations, and he is completely alone. No supplies, no medicine, nothing to rely on. And really at this point, Livingstone is simply waiting for death. He doesn't expect that he will ever leave Africa, and he feels really abandoned by everyone. Well, it's been several years now that Livingstone has been lost in Africa. And so rumors in England are swirling. There's a report that he's been murdered. There's a report that he's married an African princess. There's another report that he's appeared in South Africa. And he's sort of like Elvis. He became this like mythic figure, and everyone's got a story about him. And as you can imagine, his reputation now, this fallen British hero, is just growing. And people they want to know what happened to Livingstone. They want to know if he's still alive and what's going on. And Britain even tries to organize at this point a search party to go and find him. Well, as Livingstone is back in this village awaiting death, gunshots ring outside the village to tell of a caravan approaching, and an American flag comes into town, followed by Henry Morton Stanley, an American journalist sent by the New York Herald. And there's this beautiful, the famous line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, at the introduction of these two men. Well, Stanley had been sent out by the New York Herald to try to find Livingstone. The New York Herald was really looking to try to become a more global newspaper and breaking stories that sort of can even unseat the journalists around the world. And the Herald wanted a sensational story to do this. And so finding Livingstone, this lost British explorer, would be just such a story. Especially if they could beat these British search parties and be the one to accomplish this feat. Well, Livingstone and Stanley spent some time together. They continued Livingstone's source for a few weeks, maybe a little more than a month. And Stanley couldn't persuade Livingstone to leave Africa. He wanted to stay and complete his work so that he didn't go back to England a failure once more. But Livingstone writes a thank you note, thank you letter to the Herald, an editorial that gets splashed across headlines around the world, accompanying this great news that he's been found. And his statement is an admonition to the world to stop the slave trade. It is worse than ever. It is here, and this is a matter far greater than even finding the source of the Nile could ever be. Well, Stanley leaves, and this admonition rings around the world. Livingstone fervor grips England. And these rumors that have been swirling, it's now a storm. It's really a global storm of interest in Livingstone. That Stanley had beaten the British explorers to recover their own man. And this admonition reignited public outcry. The world once again turned its attention to the slave trade and said, this is something we actually need to solve. Well, Livingstone is still lost. He doesn't know any of this has happened. And he's continuing his search for the Nile, and he's getting sicker and sicker, and eventually collapses. His porters come to the tent one day and find Livingstone kneeling in prayer inside of his bed, but he's not moving. So they get closer, they touch his skin, and it's cold. and he's passed away in the jungle. His porters decided that the British would demand the body back, but that wasn't where Livingstone's heart was. His heart wasn't in England, his heart was in Africa. One of my favorite parts of this story is that his porters take his body and they cut open his chest and remove his heart and bury his heart in Africa under a tree. And then they embalm the body and send it back. This is where the story usually stops. This is where these stories usually end. That there's this adventure, and Livingstone and Stanley found each other, and the man was still alive, and he passed away. Well, there's more to this story, and this is part of the dots that were missing, and where my research went further. Livingstone's letters to the Herald, his editorial, his admonitions, they worked. A mere month after his death, 30 days after he passed away, all this work had been happening because of the statements he sent out, but a mere month after his death, Livingstone's protege, Dr. John Kirk, who was with him on the Zambezi expedition, is now consul in Zanzibar, which is the sultanate that controls East Africa. He negotiated a treaty with the Sultan of Zanzibar to make the slave trade completely illegal. And the hard part is, it was done at that point. 30 days after his death, the slave trade was finished. But Livingstone never knew it. He never knew that he had succeeded. He never knew that he had raised public attention for this issue, the outcry that he'd started. And he died believing he'd failed in everything. He died believing he'd failed his family, that he'd failed in exploration, that he'd even failed in abolition. And he believed the world had abandoned him. Well, as you can imagine, the slave traders did not give up that easily. There was some re-maneuvering by them, and they tried to go back overland to areas like Somalia and try to do very difficult, very dangerous, treacherous land routes to get out. Well, the death of Livingstone's death, as it's announced by, which takes a while, takes 9 months for the world to hear. His death just leads to incredible public mourning. And he's received, and when the body arrives in England, he's received once again as a hero. To a hero's welcome larger than anything he'd received before, to a procession led by the Queen's carriages, to Westminster Abbey, where he was laid to rest among some of the great heroes of Britain. Well, I'll leave you to find the details in the book on some of how the very end of it comes about. But because of Livingstone and John Kirk's work, there's a brilliant final battle where John Kirk goes into the Sultan's courtroom and really brings about the final ending, final stomp out of the slave trade, but all because of the push of Livingstone's death, and how that death, the announcement of his body arriving back in England, did more for Livingstone's work to end the slave trade than anything else he had done in his entire life. Livingstone died believing he had failed at everything. But there's a direct line of causation between his life, his work, the things that were important to him, the things he spoke out about, and the end of the slave trade. And ultimately, everything he dreamed about and imagined came to fruition. Rivers became the primary means of transportation for both business and missionaries. They really did become God's highways into Africa. Christianity took off, and largely because of Livingstone, he inspired a generation of missionaries and opened the trails for them. And now you have sub-Saharan Africa, which is overwhelmingly Christian. The mission outpost that failed on the Zambezi, that they failed to establish, well, it moved to Zanzibar, and it set up a church there. And the church was built on the site of Zanzibar's great slave market. After slavery was made illegal, they tore down the slave market, they built the church there. And another one of my favorite stories is that one of the largest stones from the slave market became the cornerstone of the church in Zanzibar. And then that mission group returned to the banks of Lake Nyassa, the epicenter of slavery, where Livingstone had wanted that colony and was told the colony couldn't be built there. Well, they built one, and they named it after him, Livingstonia. And it's one of the largest cities in that region, and was one of the mission posts for this. So I admire Livingstone for several reasons. He's human. He struggles with leadership, power. He makes mistakes, and he questions God. And he challenged me sort of existentially. He challenged me to ask, where would I want my heart to be buried if I were following in sort of the same, what am I passionate about? And it reminds me that we may not see the results of what we do or what we believe in our lifetime, and that there are all these things happening out there that we may not see the ripples of. Practically, he reminds me that advocacy can bring results. I'm reminded of the criticism of the Coney 2012 campaign last year, and but this is a story of how advocacy trumped evil in the Congo once before, and perhaps it can do it again. There's also much more to explore with Livingstone. A couple articles I've been developing out of this. I think that there's some things to be unpacked about his Christian vision for Africa and his vision for the role that he saw business and commerce playing that needs some exploring. But my questions for you, for this audience, since we're a place of reconciliation, I see Livingstone as a reconciler. The questions I'm left with, as we're still in the editing process, is the telling of this story honoring to Africa. In my mind, this has to be one of the priorities, and I've been there several times, but I'm not someone who's lived in Africa, and so there's part of that story that I don't know how it's interpreted. And then whether this story is racially and religiously welcoming. Livingstone is trying to change the perception of Africa, which was viewed as an inferior continent at that time, and that's part of the story and part of what he wants to do, and how to tell that in the right context. And Livingstone is always continuously at odds with the Arab and Muslim slave traders. And there's a tension there between faith and how they speak. And in his view, in his world, every Arab is a Muslim, and every Muslim is an Arab is part of the slave trade. And that's certainly not representative of the population, but it's a challenge that the book has to overcome. And so I'll just leave with this quote that sort of summarizes his life to me. He said, "No one can estimate the amount of God-pleasing good that will be done if by divine favor this awful slave trade be abolished. This will be something to live for." And that's really the overarching thesis of the book is this is a story to live for. I'd be happy to answer some questions about it, and if anyone has anything or any comments. Yeah.
Just a quick question to clarify about the slave trade. Who are we talking about them trading slaves with at this point?
Yeah.
Because by the time Livingstone dies, right, the slave trade is long abolished in England with Wilberforce, long abolished in the United States.
Yeah. And it's a lot more than I could get into here today because it's very complicated. The transatlantic slave trade has largely wound down, and now it's in the Arab slave trade. It's coming from Arabia. It's not going to England, but it's going to India, to the Gulf states, and one of the things that's interesting about, I think, about this story, about this book, is that no one's told that story. I didn't know there was an East African trade. So I just always heard about the Atlantic one. So one of the challenges Livingstone has to overcome is that England, Britain doesn't feel that they didn't cause this. So they're like, why do we have to do anything? And so there's an interesting question there about what responsibility do we have in the world if we see something, if we can do something. And England had the power. Yeah.
This question kind of comes from the Atlantic slave trading that went on. There was so much intertribal warfare going on that contributed to selling off of a tribe that was defeated, and that seemed to fuel the trading on the Atlantic side. Was that a part of the slave trading that he saw on the eastern side too?
It was. The Arab slave traders would instigate and equip. So they would hire a tribe to go and raid their neighboring tribe and get paid to do it. So they would instigate a whole wars between different tribes, and it was definitely part of their strategy and arming them with guns to do it. Yeah. And part of what we're trying to do with the book is really explore that story of what's happening in East Africa coming in and the Congo and Central Africa, and how that slave trade operated.
Could you also comment on and I've read very little on Livingstone, but I think that I have the impression that he is very abrasive and maybe hard to work with or hard to get along with. Definitely not one that would write a book on leadership.
Yeah, I think there are. I think you're absolutely right. I think that and that's one of the things that makes him real to me is that he wasn't perfect, and he was. There were times he showed great leadership and inspired people, and the Zambezi expedition was just a complete failure. And he could write a book about how after his wife passed, his things he really softened, and you don't always see that portrayed in some of the biographies, but. He sort of becomes a different person after one of these tipping points in his life with the failure of the Zambezi expedition. But he's certainly not a model leader in the first half of the story. Anything else I can answer? We have a couple minutes left. Well, thanks. If anybody's interested in, it's going to be all for the books actually out, but if anybody's interested in reading or giving any feedback on the content of the manuscript, I'd be eager to have conversations or talk further about that. So thanks for your time.
Thursdays I really want you to come. The other days